Editing reconciled transactions in QuickBooks Online is something that can end up really throwing a wrench in your reporting. If you're making changes to reconciled transactions, those can ripple out through your books and cause issues that create cleanup later. That being said, there are some times when you simply need to be able to edit a transaction that has been reconciled. So with that in mind, today I'm going to walk you through what elements of transactions that have been reconciled can be safely edited without causing effects that ripple out into the rest of your books. We're also going to discuss some of the transactions that simply should not be touched, especially after they've been reconciled, and what you can do in the event that you need to make changes but can't edit specific transactions. So let's go ahead and get started first by checking to see when a transaction has been reconciled and how we can confirm that. So basically, if we go into our chart of accounts, which we can access by clicking on Accounting and then selecting Chart of Accounts from this little drop-down list right here. If we go into a particular account type, either our checking account, a savings account, or a credit card, we can go ahead and view register. And then there's actually a little key that exists right here in this line that will tell us whether or not a transaction has been reconciled. Now, here's the deal. This is a sample file, so as of right now, this particular set of books is only reconciled through December 31st of 2025. So I'm going to have to go back a couple of pages worth of transactions in order to view ones that actually have been reconciled. Now, if you're ever looking at your bank register, there are a few cool things that you can do to navigate to find transactions more quickly. You can either filter by a variety of different items, including the date right here. Or if you're going back several pages, you can actually say go to page 3, for example, and it will take you to page 3 of your register so that you're not having to click each one. Additionally, it used to be in old versions of QuickBooks Online, this navigation feature was only at the bottom of the screen. So the fact that QuickBooks brought it up to the top is definitely a quality of life improvement. All that being said, here is the deal. If a transaction has an R in this little box right here, that means it has been reconciled. Okay. Now, while that does not mean that we could not make any edits to it at all, it does mean that at this point, I have to exercise extreme caution when editing the transaction. Otherwise, I can basically create changes that will throw the reconciliation out of balance, make it so that I have to fix it before I can reconcile next time, and possibly mess up reports from this prior period. And especially if we're in a situation where we've already filed our tax return, we really want to be very careful with what kinds of edits we're making, okay? So as I said, for this particular example, everything is reconciled through the end of 2025. Let's say for the sake of argument that I am currently on extension for this business. I have not yet filed my tax return. Therefore, making edits to certain transactions won't have any tax implications for me, but it might be necessary for me to make small edits to clean things up so that my reports are more complete and accurate. So let's go ahead and look at the transactions where we could theoretically make changes, and then we'll discuss where we can actually make those changes. So first things first, if we are dealing with transfers between accounts, if we are dealing with anything that is linked to accounts payable or accounts receivable, we really don't want to be making changes to those transactions after they have been reconciled. And here's why. If it is linked to another transaction on top of being reconciled, we don't want to unmatch or delete or do anything that would not only have implications here in this particular account register and on these reconciliation reports, but that would ripple through the rest of our reports, okay? If I make a change to something that is tied to accounts receivable, that is also going to affect the balance in my accounts receivable reports, okay? So we want to be very, very careful. It's why it is incredibly important to follow accounts receivable and accounts payable processes and the whole workflow. I do have separate videos for that. Those will be linked here. This is not what we're covering today though. So I am going to move on from this. Let's just say if you're on the fence about editing, do not edit accounts payable, accounts receivable, or transfers between accounts, because those are ones that are going to directly hit other accounts and other reports. Here are the ones that we can edit. We can edit things that are just straight deposits, and we can edit things that are just straight expenses. Okay, so this transaction, for example, we have bookkeeping services to Isabel King here, right? If I were to go in and click edit, all right, so we can edit deposit transactions with certain information, but let's first talk about what we cannot edit on a deposit transaction. If the transaction has been reconciled, we cannot change the account that it is being deposited into. We also should not change the date, okay? After that, however, we have a little bit more flexibility with what we can change. For example, if for some reason the person that the money was received from was incorrectly recorded, I could change that if I wanted to or needed to. Additionally, I can change the account that the income amount is going into. So if this was actually training materials, I could switch that to training materials. We can see here, this is from Isabel King, right? So I'm not going to make a change here. But let's say that I realized after the fact that this transaction was not 100% for bookkeeping services, and instead was partially for bookkeeping services and partially for training materials, okay? So I'm going to say that she spent $300 on training materials, and the rest of this overall amount should have gone to bookkeeping services. Now, here is the critical thing that we have to pay attention to on these transactions. When we edit a reconciled transaction, the final dollar amount that was reconciled has to be the same as the amount of the transaction that we save. Okay, so if I go in here and say that she spent $300 on training materials, we can see that changes this overall amount of this transaction by $300. So in order to safely save this transaction without messing up my reconciliation, I have to be sure to subtract the $300 from this number here. Okay, and this is one of those areas where I really like being able to use the built-in calculator in the dollar field section in QuickBooks Online. And it is because it helps to ensure accuracy. Okay, obviously I picked a nice round number for the purposes of this example, but you're not always going to be dealing with nice round numbers, and it just helps to have that little double check. Okay, so if I hit tab here, it's automatically going to calculate the amount that should be there. And as we can see, the overall amount of our transaction has now gone back to $1,141.56. So if that was all I was changing on this transaction, that would be completely fine and totally safe to do, okay? I have not changed the dollar amount, the overall dollar amount of the transaction, but I have changed how the transaction was broken out. I have also not changed the account that it was deposited into or the date that the transaction took place. Again, all of these are really critical, important things if we have already reconciled this account, okay? And once you have edited whatever you want to edit on here, again, within those safe parameters, you can go ahead and either hit Save and New or Save and Close. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that sometimes a little dialog box will pop up saying, this transaction has been reconciled. Are you sure you want to make these changes? And this is a really great little gut check, okay? You don't want to make changes that will ultimately upset the reconciliation. So just double check, do your due diligence, and make sure that the changes that you're making to the transaction will not mess up your overall account balance or anything else, okay? Another type of transaction that we can actually edit is expense transactions, okay? So for example, we have this one right here. This co-working space is going to rent currently, okay? If it turned out that this particular transaction was actually a different vendor, I could change that. And if I wanted it to go to a different category, I could change that as well and have it, again, be perfectly safe. Additionally, we can still split out these types of transactions. So if some of it was for rent and some of it was for utilities, let's say, for example, that 700 was actually supposed to be for rent, and the other, I have electricity in here. The other 150 was supposed to be for electricity, okay? And it was still to that co-working space. We can see this is another example of where the changes that I am making have not materially changed this transaction. I have not changed the account that the transaction was drafted from. I have not changed the date that the transaction took place, and I have not changed the dollar amount of the transaction. That means that this is a safe edit to make, okay? I'll go ahead and hit save and close here. Oh, and here we go. Here's that little dialog box that I was talking about that will occasionally come up. It's asking if I am sure that I want to make this change given the fact that this transaction has already been reconciled. And since I know this is not making a material change, I can go ahead and say yes. All right, so this is basically how you safely edit transactions in QuickBooks Online. There are only certain types of transactions that can be safely edited. Again, we're not dealing with anything in Accounts Payable, anything in Accounts Receivable, or any transfers between your accounts. That includes payments to credit cards. And additionally, we want to be sure that we are not materially changing the transaction, meaning we're not changing what account was assigned to it in QuickBooks Online, whether it came out of the checking account, the savings account, or a credit card. We are not changing the date the transaction took place, and we are not changing the overall dollar amount of the transaction, okay? As long as those criteria are met, it is generally safe to make small edits to reconciled transactions. That being said, I do highly, highly recommend not making a habit of it because it is so very easy to make a fat finger error or to accidentally click on the wrong thing and possibly mess up your reconciliations, which is something that we just don't want to do. So I say only edit transactions when it is absolutely necessary, when it is material to your reporting, when you really want to correct an error that has an effect on your profit and loss or balance sheet. All those are instances where it's fine, but really it would be best if we can work very carefully while we are entering transactions so that we're not creating instances where we have to make these edits after the fact. The final thing that I'll say here is that if you are trying to edit a transaction from a prior year and your tax return has already been filed, I would just say stop and don't do that, okay? This means that this has already been reported to the IRS, the expenses that you've declared, your income, and possibly your balance sheet, depending on the type of business that you have and how much in the way of assets and liabilities you have, okay? If all of that information has been reported to the IRS already and you're making changes to it after the fact, that can mess up your ability to defend whatever was reported if you are audited, okay? So if you get in and it turns out that there's a big change that needs to be made in the prior year, definitely reach out to your CPA and see how they would like to handle it, okay? Depending on how big a change it is and how material it is to your books and to your taxes, they may recommend filing an amended return. Otherwise, if it's something somewhat negligible that just needs to be fixed, they might end up recommending a journal entry to adjust it in the current year so that it doesn't impact any of your prior year taxes. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Holly from Accrual Mistress Bookkeeping and Consulting. I hope you found this helpful. If you did, please do like and subscribe, and I hope you have a lovely day.